It's a common misconception that the Viking Age ended with Christianization or the establishment of kingdoms in Scandinavia. But the truth, and perhaps the most controversial, is that the Viking Age had a dramatic and violent end, and it has a name: Harald Hardrada. What many don't know is that the last great Viking warrior, a man who amassed a legendary fortune and ruled an empire with an iron fist, didn't die on a raiding adventure, but in one of history's most decisive battles, one that would forever change the fate not only of his nation, but also of England and all of Europe. How did a man who fled his homeland at age 15, wounded and defeated, become the commander of the feared Varangian Guard in Constantinople, amass a fortune in gold, and return home to claim the throne? And how did this same man, in his final quest for glory, end up being the catalyst for the rise of William the Conqueror? The end of one empire is often the birth of another, and the story of Harald Hardrada is living proof of that. If you're ready to dive into the details of an epic life and discover how one man's ambition shaped the world, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Your participation helps spread knowledge to more people. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what other great story you'd like to see here. The 11th century dawned on Scandinavia not as the end of an era, but as its peak, a cauldron of ambition, iron, and blood. The time of great raids and explorations that had taken the Vikings to distant lands, from Eastern Europe to North America, was in a tumultuous phase of transition. Norway, in particular, was a mosaic of small kingdoms and warlords, each with their own laws and their own thirst for power. There was no unity, only brute force to dictate who ruled what and for how long. Life was short, death was violent, and glory, measured in gold and power, was the only legacy a man could hope to leave. This scenario of fragmentation and constant conflict was the fertile ground where the fiercest warriors were born, men whose names would become legends. For a young prince, born into nobility but not to uncontested power, Norway was both a promise and a prison. The promise of a throne he would have to forge with his sword, and the prison of a destiny that depended on his ability to overcome more powerful adversaries. This was the world of Harald Sigurdsson, and this was his reality. Viking society, though brutal, was complex. Honor was more valuable than life itself, and poetry and oral law were as important as the axe and shield. Clans and families were intertwined in fragile intrigues and alliances, where loyalty could be bought or betrayed with equal ease. War was not just a way to expand territories, but a means of accumulating wealth and, more importantly, of building a lasting reputation. For young nobles, war was the ultimate rite of passage. To participate in a great battle, survive and fight bravely, was the only way to prove one's worth and secure a place in the sagas that would be sung for generations. Leaders needed to be not only formidable warriors, but also astute strategists and charismatic figures, capable of inspiring unconditional loyalty in their followers, as a defeat could mean exile, ruin, and in many cases, death. This world of relentless ambition and calculated violence was about to shape the life of one of its most notable and brutal sons. In the midst of this chaotic scene, the figure of Olaf Haraldsson, Harald's older half-brother, emerged. He would later be known as Olaf the Saint. Olaf was a Christian king, and his ascension to the throne in 1015 represented an attempt to centralize power and unify the kingdom under a single faith and a single crown. However, his vision of a Christian and unified Norway directly clashed with the ancestral traditions and fierce independence of the tribal chiefs and pagan warriors. Norway was divided. On one side were those who saw Christianity as a path to civilization and political power, aligned with the rest of Europe. On the other was the majority of the population who clung to the old Norse gods, the rituals of their ancestors, and the freedom to follow their own customs. Olaf II imposed Christianity with an iron hand, destroying pagan temples and forcing the conversion of his subjects. His policies, while aiming for unity, bred resentment and resistance. Many clan chiefs, who saw their authority and traditions threatened, openly opposed him. This simmering tension turned Norway into a powder keg, with the loyalty of the nobles wavering between the crown and tradition. The king in turn believed that the salvation of the kingdom lay in faith and obedience. But his autocratic methods created more enemies than followers. The opposition grew, both secretly and openly, led by powerful nobles who, with the help of foreign powers like Denmark, plotted the king's downfall. It was in this environment of betrayal and religious fervor that Harald grew up, absorbing the brutal lessons of how faith and power could be both a source of strength and a fatal vulnerability. He witnessed firsthand how his brother's ambition to unify Norway through religion became the same ambition that would eventually lead to his death, and this lesson would never be forgotten. In 1030, the accumulated tension in Norway exploded at the Battle of Stiklestad. A young Harald, just 15 years old, was there. The teenager was not just an observer, but an active participant, fighting bravely alongside his half-brother, King Olaf. For Harald, the battle was a trial by fire, a chance to prove his worth and his loyalty to a king who, to him, was a figure of authority and inspiration. He wielded his sword with the fury of a veteran, fighting shoulder to shoulder with older, more experienced men, defending his brother's cause against the alliance of rebellious nobles and Danes. The day was shrouded in mist, and the air was heavy with the sound of clashing shields and the war cries of men. Harald, in the midst of the combat, was a figure of determination. He was not just a young man following orders, but someone forging his destiny with every strike of his blade. However, the tide of the battle turned. Olaf's army, outnumbered and with less local support than expected, began to give way. At the height of the chaos, Harald was struck. A sword or axe found its mark, and the young man fell, wounded in the neck. Amid the carnage, he lay on the ground at Stiklestad, his body covered in mud and blood, while the world around him crumbled. It was there, on that field of defeat and death, that he witnessed the end of his brother's dream, and more crucially, the death of Olaf himself. The moment of his defeat was not just a personal failure, but the turning point that launched him on a journey that would transform him from a defeated prince into one of the greatest warriors of his time. He survived, but the experience marked him forever, instilling in him a caution and pragmatism that few Viking leaders possessed. From then on, defeat would not just be a setback, but a relentless teacher. With his body still wounded and his soul scarred by the defeat at Stiklestad, Harald's life was turned upside down. The dream of power in Norway had been shattered, and all that was left for him was to flee. He was no longer a prince in his own country, but a fugitive. With a small group of loyal warriors, he began a long and dangerous journey to the east. His route took him through the icy landscapes and dense forests of Sweden, as he fled from the victorious enemies who now controlled Norway. The journey was a test of endurance, where survival depended on cunning and willpower, not on titles or wealth. With every step, Harald was not just running but also seeking a new purpose. Eastern Europe, known to the Norse as Gardariki, was a world of opportunity for a landless warrior. The trade routes and emerging kingdoms of the region, especially the Rus of Kiev, were attractive destinations for men-at-arms. His journey was not a passive exile, but an active search for a new destiny, a place where his skills as a warrior could be valued and where he could rebuild the fortune and power he had lost. The landscape gradually changed, the dense Norse forests giving way to the vast steppes and navigable rivers of the east. His arrival in the Rus of Kiev was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new life. He did not arrive as a king, but as a mercenary, and it was there, far from his homeland, that he would begin to write a new chapter, not as the brother of a defeated king, but as the builder of a personal empire, paved with the reputation he would earn on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. This flight was not just an escape, but the first crucial step of his transformation, a rite of passage that prepared him for the greatness and horrors that awaited him. After his arduous journey, Harald arrived at the Rus of Kiev, the kingdom of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav's court was a center of power and culture, a crossroads between the Slavic and Norse worlds, and a refuge for exiled warriors. For Harald, it was the opportunity he had been looking for. He presented himself to Yaroslav not as a defeated prince, but as an experienced warrior in search of service. The prince, a shrewd and observant man, saw the potential in Harald, noting his resilience and the aura of a man who had already faced death. He accepted him into his army, and Harald quickly proved his worth. He distinguished himself not only in battles, but also in plundering raids and missions to protect Yaroslav's trade routes. Serving Yaroslav was a different kind of war school from anything he had known in Norway. Instead of clan-based combat tactics, he learned to deal with the complex war scenarios of Eastern Europe, facing the steppes and the strategies of the peoples of the South and East. He was no longer a tribal warrior, but a soldier of a rising empire. His experience expanded. His skills were honed. He was relentless, loyal, and above all, effective. While serving Yaroslav, Harald also met Elizabeth of Kiev, the prince's daughter, and a passion was kindled between them. The sagas say that Harald composed poetry for her, an unexpected and romantic side to the brutal warrior. This love for Elizabeth would be one of the reasons that would lead him to accumulate the wealth needed to eventually claim his rightful place in Scandinavia. Yaroslav's court not only gave him shelter and a new purpose, but also prepared him for the challenges that would follow, molding him into a more complete and astute leader, ready to move beyond Kiev. Harald's reputation as a formidable warrior soon reached the ears of Yaroslav the Wise. The prince, recognizing the potential and ambition of his Norse commander, saw an opportunity to strengthen his own alliances. At the time, the Ruses of Kiev maintained diplomatic and military relations with the powerful Byzantine Empire, whose capital, Constantinople, was the richest and most dazzling city in the known world. The heart of Byzantine power was its elite guard, the famous Varangian Guard, composed of warriors of Norse origin. For a man like Harald, the call of Constantinople was irresistible. It was the place where glory and wealth met in their purest form, a global stage to test his worth. Yaroslav sent him to the imperial court, a strategic decision to please the emperor and, at the same time, offer his most talented warrior a chance to shine and to accumulate a fortune for himself. For Harald, the promise of glory was much more than the opportunity to join an elite force. It was the chance to rise from the ashes of his defeat in Norway. In his mind, every battle, every treasure, every victory he won in the south would be one more step on his way back home, to reclaim the throne that had been taken from him. Constantinople was not just a city, it was a legend, a beacon of wealth and power that attracted every warrior hungry for fame and fortune. The journey to the south, across vast lands and sea routes, was not just a trip but a pilgrimage to the center of the known world, where he would be tested to the maximum, and, if he was lucky, would return home as a living legend. Harald's ambition, forged in exile, was leading him to a stage that would change his life forever and shape his image as the most legendary Viking of all time. Upon arriving in Constantinople, the magnificence of the imperial city astounded Harald. Its walls, its palaces, its churches filled with gold and mosaics, all of it was a world away from the rough stone halls of Norway. But what really caught his attention was the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine emperor's elite force. These men, mostly of Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon origin, were the best warriors in the empire, serving as the ruler's personal bodyguards. They were easily recognizable by their long axes and their reputation for unshakable loyalty and ferocity in combat. For a warrior like Harald, it was paradise. His first contact with the Guard was not subservient. Harald already had the reputation of a rising military leader from the Ruses of Kiev. He was not a novice but a veteran who sought service. His strength, his battle experience, and his determined attitude impressed the Guard's leaders. They accepted him into their ranks, and Harald joined that brotherhood of warriors. For him, serving in the Varangian Guard was more than a job. It was a global school of war. He would learn Byzantine combat tactics, siege strategies, and Roman military discipline, which was very different from the more tribal way of battle of the Vikings. Harald adapted quickly, mastering the nuances of war in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. He not only integrated, but quickly began to stand out. The challenges of life in the Varangian Guard, from diplomatic missions to the most brutal combat, not only tested his character, but molded him into a warrior of a different class, a man who combined Viking fury with the discipline and experience of an imperial soldier. Harald's entry into the Varangian Guard marked the beginning of a meteoric rise. It didn't take long for his skill on the battlefield to stand out. Unlike many of his peers, Harald was not just strong but also a strategist. He understood the complexities of Byzantine maneuvers and the discipline of organized warfare, but he still maintained the ferocity and unpredictability of the Viking warrior. His effectiveness in combat was legendary. Byzantine sources describe him as a man of unparalleled strength and courage, who led men by example, always on the front lines, where the danger was greatest. His talent for battle quickly led to his promotion. He became the commander of the Guard, a position of immense prestige and power, directly linked to the emperor's security. Harald not only led the Guard, but also advised the emperor on military matters. He participated in several campaigns on behalf of the Byzantine Empire, from North Africa, where he helped suppress revolts, to Sicily, where he fought against the Arabs. In each of these expeditions, he not only accumulated victories but also vast wealth from plunder. He became famous throughout Constantinople. To the Byzantines, he was a brave and loyal warrior. To the Vikings in the Guard, he was a living legend, a leader to be followed without question. His rise in the Varangian Guard was not just proof of his military capability, but also of his political cunning. He successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the Byzantine court, making allies and avoiding traps. He became more than a warrior. He was a leader of men, a commander, and the most powerful man in the Varangian Guard, a remarkable feat for an exiled prince. Harald's rise in the Varangian Guard was accompanied by a reputation that transcended the borders of Constantinople. His ferocity on the battlefield and his lack of mercy toward enemies earned him the epithet that would become his name, Harald the Merciless, or Harald Hardrada in Old Norse. He was not just a warrior, he was a force of nature. Medieval sources describe him as someone who not only won, but crushed his enemies. In battles in Sicily and North Africa, his men were notorious for their brutality, and Harald was always at the forefront, leading by example. The legend of his cruelty and effectiveness spread throughout the Byzantine Empire and beyond, serving as a psychological weapon against his adversaries. The stories of his ferocity were not just battle tales. They also served a practical purpose. The fear Harald inspired in his enemies often broke their morale before the battle even began. In sieges of cities, he was known for using tactics that broke the will of the defenders, such as burning villages and crops, and leaving no survivors. This reputation made him an invaluable asset to the Byzantine emperor. He was the man the emperor sent when a quick and brutal victory was needed. While the Byzantines valued his effectiveness, the peoples he subjugated feared him. This reputation for mercilessness was not a weakness, but a strength, a symbol of his pragmatism and determination. For Harald, war was not a game of chivalry. It was the only way to secure power and wealth. He embraced his nickname, and with each new victory, the legend of Harald Hardrada became more and more real, setting the stage for his return to Scandinavia, where he would use this same reputation to claim a throne. Under the banner of the Byzantine Empire, Harald Hardrada became a war veteran in the Mediterranean, a region rich in conflicts and opportunities. His military campaigns in Sicily and North Africa were not just a means to accumulate victories, but also to forge his fortune. Sicily, then controlled by Arab forces, was a melting pot of cultures and a constant battlefield. Harald led the Varangians in several assaults, conquering cities and fortresses, and plundering the vast treasure of the caliphs. He and his men were known for their ferocity and for leaving no stone unturned, collecting gold, silver, and jewels with every victory. In North Africa, Harald participated in campaigns to suppress local revolts and expand Byzantine influence. In these distant lands, he faced different war tactics, adapting to fight in hostile climates and terrains. The victories in these campaigns not only solidified his military reputation, but also filled the coffers of the Varangian Guard, and consequently, his own. The Norwegian sagas say that he accumulated a fortune so vast that few men possessed as much in gold and jewels as he did. But this information has no historical proof. The stories about his wealth are, however, fundamental to his legend. He was, supposedly, the richest man in the north, and this wealth would be the key to his triumphant return. Harald was not just fighting for someone else's empire, he was fighting for himself. building a power that he would use to regain what was taken from him. Every gold coin he collected, every gem he found, was one more step in his plan to return. And if this story of ambition and wealth surprised you, please like to help us spread knowledge and bring this saga to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. Would you like to suggest another story you would love to see on our channel? Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your participation helps us continue. In addition to his official campaigns in the Mediterranean, the legend of Harald Hardrada is filled with stories about his supposed expeditions in the Middle East, where he would have plundered holy cities and accumulated priceless treasures. Most of these stories have no solid historical proof, but they serve to cement his reputation as a legendary looter. One of the most famous legends says that he led a secret expedition to steal treasures from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Although the historicity of this event is highly questionable, the story reflects Harald's audacity and ambition. Other legends claim that he would have stolen treasures from mosques and churches in the Middle East, hiding part of his fortune in tombs or remote locations, away from prying eyes. And this information, like the previous one, has no historical sources to prove it. These stories, regardless of their veracity, serve to illustrate a crucial point about Harald's reputation. He was seen as a man who was willing to do anything to accumulate wealth and power. There were no geographical or moral boundaries that could contain his ambition. The legend of the hidden gold reinforced the idea that his wealth was so vast that he could not simply carry it, but had to hide it for future use. This mystery surrounding his fortune only increased his fascination and power. Money was a tool, but the legend surrounding the money was a weapon. Harald knew how to use this to his advantage, turning rumors into reality and legends into political power. His life was a tapestry of facts and myths, and he was the master of weaving his own narrative, one that painted him as an unstoppable warrior and a man of incalculable fortune, ready to return home and claim his destiny. The power and wealth that Harald accumulated in the Byzantine court inevitably attracted envy and intrigue. The Byzantine Empire was a snake pit, where politics was a deadly game of betrayal and conspiracy. Harald's popularity among his men and his closeness to Emperor Constantine IX Monomachus made him a dangerous figure for his rivals at court. The Byzantine nobles, accustomed to their own power games, viewed the rise of a barbarian in such influential positions with suspicion. The conspiracy against him began to form in the shadows of the imperial palaces. He was falsely accused of embezzling imperial treasures, and according to the sagas, of dishonoring a noblewoman from Constantinople. Although the exact historicity of the accusations is uncertain, the result was brutally real. Harald, the war hero of the empire, was arrested and thrown into a dungeon. For the Byzantine nobles, it was a way to neutralize a growing threat and recover the treasures he had accumulated. For Harald, imprisonment was the greatest betrayal. After years of unwavering loyalty and service, he was cast aside like a piece of trash. However, his imprisonment was also a crucial turning point. Far from breaking his spirit, the experience only made him more determined. He understood that loyalty was a fragile concept, and that the only person he could trust was himself. Imprisonment gave him the opportunity to reflect, to plan his revenge and his return. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a survivor, a man who had faced death in battle and betrayal in the corridors of power. This experience hardened him, sharpening his pragmatism and his distrust. He knew that to return to Norway, he would need more than strength. He would need a cunning that had been forged in the darkness of a Byzantine cell. The story of Harald Hardrada's imprisonment would be incomplete without the legend of his spectacular escape. According to the sagas, Harald did not resign himself to his fate. A man who had survived battles, exile, and betrayal would not be defeated by 4 stone walls. His escape was worthy of an epic. He relied on the help of some loyal Varangian warriors who still respected him. The plan was bold and risky, but it was his only chance for freedom. On a dark and stormy night, with the help of his men, he managed to free himself from his cell, overpowering the guards and making his way through the palace corridors. The legend also says that they used a rope to descend from the high city walls and reach the coast, where a ship was waiting for them. His escape was not just a flight, but an audacious affront to imperial power. He had escaped from the most powerful man in the world, Constantine, and this only added to his legend. He not only fled, but also managed to recover part of his hidden treasure. With his fortune and the loyalty of his men, he left Constantinople, heading for his homeland, Scandinavia. Harald's escape was not just the end of his service to the Byzantine Empire, but the beginning of his last and grandest journey. He was not returning as a beggar or a fugitive, but as a hardened warrior, with a fortune and a legend that would precede him. He had learned the hardest lessons about power, betrayal, and loyalty, and now he was ready to apply those lessons in his own kingdom. His revenge against those who betrayed him and his quest for the throne of Norway were about to begin, and he would let nothing stop him. After years of exile and service in Constantinople, Harald Hardrada's journey came to an end when he returned to Scandinavia. However, the man who returned was not the same wounded boy who fled Stiklestad. He was a legendary warrior, with scars from countless battles, the experience of an imperial commander, and a fortune so vast that it became part of his legend. The news of his return spread like wildfire, and he was more of a myth than a man. The sagas sang of his victories, his brutality, his cunning, and his treasure, but there is no historical proof of his return with this great treasure. Harald returned not to hide, but to claim what he believed was his by right. He was not alone. He brought with him a personal guard of veterans, men who had fought alongside him in distant lands, and who were fiercely loyal to him. His presence in Scandinavia represented an immediate threat to the established power. The throne of Norway, now occupied by his nephew, King Magnus, was not the only prize he coveted. He also had an eye on Denmark, ruled by Svein Estridsson, a longtime rival of Magnus. Harald's return was not just a personal event, but a political earthquake that destabilized the balance of power in the region. His rivals knew that they were not dealing with a local noble, but with a global warrior, a man who had faced armies, sailed on unknown seas, and survived the intrigues of Constantinople. His arrival set the stage for the last and most brutal struggle for power in Norway, a struggle he was determined to win at all costs. Upon his return to Scandinavia, Harald did not act impulsively. He was aware of his nephew's power, King Magnus, and knew that a direct attack would be risky. Instead, he made the first of many astute political moves. He approached Svein Estridsson, the King of Denmark. Svein was Magnus's main rival, vying for control of both Norway and Denmark. For Harald, Svein was the perfect tool to destabilize his nephew's power. He offered Svein an alliance, uniting their forces to attack Magnus. The bargain was simple and based on mutual convenience. Svein would gain a powerful military ally, and Harald would gain a base of operations and a pretext to invade Norway. The alliance with Svein Estridsson was a demonstration of Harald's cunning. He was not interested in loyalty or honor, but in results. He knew that Svein was not trustworthy, but he saw him as a means to an end. Together, they began to launch attacks on the Norwegian coast, plundering villages and towns, with the aim of undermining Magnus's authority and forcing him into negotiations. The tactic worked. Magnus, feeling the pressure from the combined attacks of Harald and Svein, realized that the war would be long and bloody. The alliance of the two hardened warriors, a former king of Denmark and the legendary Merciless of Constantinople, was a threat he could not ignore. The bargain with Svein was Harald's first step to regaining his throne, and it proved that, after years of exile, he had become a master of the Scandinavian power game. Harald's alliance with Svein Estridsson proved to be a success. The pressure on King Magnus became unbearable. If the war continued, both Norway and Denmark would be devastated, and political instability could lead to an invasion from other kingdoms. Magnus, the man who had inherited the kingdom from his father, the Saint Olaf, was now in a precarious position. He made the only move that could save his kingdom. He approached Harald to negotiate. The proposed agreement was audacious and unexpected. Magnus and Harald would share the throne of Norway. They would rule the kingdom together as co-kings. For many, the idea of a king sharing power with a rival would be unthinkable. But for Magnus, it was the best option to avoid a devastating civil war. For Harald, the agreement represented an unprecedented victory. He had regained his throne without having to shed more Norwegian blood, but there was still a betrayal in his heart. He had abandoned his ally, Svein Estridsson, who had fought alongside him and helped him pressure King Magnus. At the time of the agreement, Svein realized that he had been used, and the friendship between the two kings turned into a rivalry that would last for years. The pact between Magnus and Harald was a crucial turning point in Norway's history. It showed that Harald was more than a warrior, but also an astute diplomat. He had used his reputation, his fortune, and his alliance with Svein to achieve his ultimate goal. The fate of two men was now intertwined, and the future of Norway hung by a thread, with the promise of peace, but the threat of conflict always lurking. The co-governance agreement between Harald and Magnus seemed to have established a lasting peace in Norway. The two kings, one young and one a war veteran, began to work together to govern the kingdom. However, fate intervened dramatically. Just a year after the agreement, in 1047, King Magnus died unexpectedly. The sagas say he died of an illness, but there are suspicions that the death was not natural, leaving to history the doubt of whether it was something planned by Harald, but without any proof. Magnus's death left the throne of Norway vacant, and Harald quickly took control. He was no longer a co-king, but the sole and uncontested king of Norway. The man who had fled his homeland as a wounded young man, returned as a legendary warrior, and now reigned supreme. Magnus's death marked the beginning of Harald's reign, which would be one of the most brutal and ambitious in Norway's history. He no longer had to share power with anyone, and there were no more limits to his ambition. Norway, for the first time in years, had a single leader, one who had learned the hardest lessons about war, betrayal, and power. Harald's reign would be marked by his brutality and his relentless quest for expansion. He would rule with an iron fist, crushing any opposition and unifying the kingdom under his will. He would not be content to be just the king of Norway. He wanted to be the king of the entire Viking world, a goal that would lead him to his last and greatest battle. Magnus's death was the key that opened the doors to Harald's ambition, and the Scandinavian world was about to feel the impact of his reign. Harald Hardrada's reign as the sole king of Norway was marked by relentless severity. He was not a benevolent king, but a pragmatic ruler who believed that the only way to unify a fragmented kingdom was through force. His first objective was to consolidate his power, crushing any opposition that dared to challenge him. Rebellious nobles were hunted down, their fortresses were burned, and their families were punished. Harald did not hesitate to use terror as a tool of control. Those who defied him were summarily executed, and their properties were confiscated. Norway, accustomed to internal conflicts and the autonomy of clan chiefs, was now under the control of a single and uncontested power. His policy of repression, though brutal, was effective. In a few years, he unified Norway like never before, creating a centralized and powerful kingdom. He established new laws, collected taxes, and strengthened the kingdom's economy. His experience in Constantinople had taught him about the power of organization and bureaucracy, and he applied those lessons in his own kingdom. He built a capital in Oslo, which became a center of trade and power, and strengthened Norway's defenses against its enemies. However, the price of this unity was freedom. Many of the nobles who had opposed him were forced into exile, and those who remained lived in fear. Harald's kingdom was a kingdom of order and strength, but also of oppression. He did not care about being a popular king, but about being a powerful king, and for that, he used every means necessary. One of the greatest contradictions in Harald Hardrada's life is the dichotomy between his brutality as a warrior and his more sensitive side as a poet and patron of the arts. While he was known for his cruelty on the battlefield, the sagas also describe him as a skald, a Viking poet, who composed complex and emotional verses. The art of Norse poetry was a rite of passage for many nobles, but for Harald, it was more than just a skill. It was a way to express his emotions, to record his victories, to mourn his defeats, and to celebrate his life. His court was a center of culture and learning, where poets and artists were welcomed and rewarded. He was not just a patron, but also an active participant in the artistic scene. He challenged other skalds in poetry competitions and used his art to strengthen his legend and his reputation. This duality of character is fascinating. The man who could order the death of dozens of men in one day could, the next day, sit in his hall and compose verses about love and nature. This contradiction suggests that Harald was a complex man who did not fit into a single definition. He was a man who understood that strength was not just physical, but also intellectual and cultural. He used poetry to shape his image, to celebrate his greatness, and to leave a mark on history. The fact that such a brutal warrior was also a poet adds a new layer of depth to his story and shows that his ambition was not just for political power, but also for immortality in legends and sagas. Harald Hardrada's peace with Norway was just the prelude to a new conflict. His betrayal of Svein Estridsson, the king of Denmark, in the agreement with Magnus, had left an open wound. Svein, the man who had helped pressure Magnus and clear the way for Harald to become king, was now his bitterest enemy. The conflict between the two was inevitable. For years they waged a war of attrition, with attacks and counterattacks that left the Scandinavian region in a constant state of alert. Harald could not forget that Svein was a threat to his power, and Svein could not forgive Harald's betrayal. The war was relentless and bloody. The battles between the two kings were legendary, and the sea became a battlefield. Harald's and Svein's fleets clashed in epic confrontations, with ships colliding and men fighting for their lives. The war was a test of Harald's endurance, who used his experience and cunning to overcome his rival. He led devastating attacks on the Danish coasts, plundering and burning villages. Svein, though a capable leader, was never a match for Harald's brutality and effectiveness. The conflict, however, did not have a final objective of total conquest. It was a war of attrition, a struggle for dominance and honor. The rivalry between the two kings was personal, and with each battle, the legend of Harald Hardrada grew. He was the most powerful Viking of his time, a man who was not afraid to challenge anyone who stood in his way. The war with Denmark was a constant reminder that peace was a temporary state, and that force was the only thing that mattered in the Viking world. The war against Svein Estridsson required Harald Hardrada to become a master of naval warfare, a skill he had honed since his time in Constantinople. He knew that the key to victory in Scandinavia was control of the seas, and for that, he needed an unparalleled war fleet. Harald invested a large part of his fortune and the kingdom's resources in building an armada. He commissioned the construction of dozens of drakars, the fearsome Viking warships, and recruited the best sailors and warriors in Norway. Harald's fleet was legendary for its speed, its strength, and its brutality. His mastery of naval warfare was not just about the size of his fleet, but about his tactics. He used the fleet to launch quick and devastating attacks on the Danish coasts, where Svein had few defenses. He used the fleet to transport his warriors to the battlefield and to cut off his enemies' supply routes. Harald's fleet was more than an army. It was a symbol of his power and his ambition. His ability to lead a war fleet earned him the respect of his men and the fear of his enemies. He was a commander who could fight both on land and at sea, and this versatility made him a formidable adversary. The power of his fleet was a crucial factor in the war against Svein, and it was this same fleet that he would use in his last and grandest expedition. Harald was not just a king, but an admiral, and the sea was his domain. During the years of war against Svein Estridsson, Harald Hardrada and his fleet became terrifying for the Danish population. The raids in Denmark were not just strategic attacks, but also acts of pure revenge. Harald was determined to show Svein that he had made a mistake by challenging him. The Norwegian and Danish sagas are full of stories of his brutality and plundering. He burned entire cities, plundered churches and villages, and left nothing but ashes and despair. The legend of his cruelty grew with each new attack. He was a scourge, a force of nature that no one could stop. To the Danes, Harald was a monster, a man without mercy who did not care about the lives he destroyed. But to the Norwegians, he was a hero, a king who was fighting for his people and his kingdom. His brutality served a purpose. He wanted to break Svein's will and force him to surrender. He wanted to show the world that Norway, under his reign, would not be a kingdom to be underestimated. His reputation for mercilessness was not just a legend, but a tool of war. He used fear as a weapon, and it worked. The Danish population cried out for peace, and Sweyn, in turn, was pressured by his own nobles to find a solution. The war between the two kings was not a war of honor, but a war of survival, and Harald was willing to do whatever it took to win. After more than 15 years of conflict, the war between Harald Hardrada and Sweyn Estridsson finally came to an end. Both kings were exhausted, their economies were in tatters, and their peoples were crying out for peace. In 1064, they agreed to sign a peace treaty. The agreement was simple, but significant. Both kings would recognize the existing borders of their kingdoms, and neither would make new claims to land. Peace was a relief for both sides, but it was also a victory for Harald. He had fought against his rival for years and had emerged victorious. Sweyn had been forced to recognize Harald's power and the strength of his kingdom. The end of the war with Denmark freed Harald to focus on his next and most ambitious project, the conquest of England. Peace in Scandinavia was just the prelude to a new and greater conflict. Harald, who had spent his life in search of power and glory, knew that Norway was too small for his ambitions. He needed a larger kingdom, a richer kingdom. England, with its wealth and political instability, was the perfect target. The peace with Sweyn allowed him to gather his forces and prepare for the largest and last expedition of his life. He was no longer fighting against a rival. He was fighting for an empire. The end of the war with Denmark marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Peace was just a means to an end, and Harald's goal was glory and power. In January 1066, the death of Edward the Confessor, King of England, triggered one of the most important succession crises in European history. Edward had no heirs, and his death left the English throne in dispute. 3 men claimed the right to rule England. Harold Godwinson, a powerful English noble who was crowned king shortly after Edward's death. William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed to have a promise from Edward that he would be his successor, and Harald Hardrada, who claimed to have a succession agreement from his nephew, King Magnus, with King Harthacnut, a former king of Denmark and England. For Harald, the claim was more than a matter of right. It was a matter of ambition. He was already the king of Norway, but England, with its wealth and prosperity, was a much more tempting prize. His claim, although weak from a legal point of view, was reinforced by his reputation as an invincible warrior and by his powerful fleet. He knew that the English throne would not be given to him. He would have to fight for it. The death of Edward the Confessor opened the doors to a new era of conflict. Harald, who had spent his life in search of power and glory, saw in England the opportunity to achieve his final destiny. He wanted to be not just the king of Norway, but the king of an empire that stretched across the entire North Sea. He was determined to take what he believed was his by right, and for that he was ready to risk everything. Harald Hardrada was not a man of half measures. After deciding on his claim to the English throne, he prepared for his last and grandest military expedition. He ordered the construction of a gigantic fleet, the largest Norway had ever seen, and recruited the best warriors in his kingdom. The fleet consisted of hundreds of ships loaded with men and supplies ready for the invasion. He also had the support of Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of Harald Godwinson, who offered him support and knowledge of the English defenses. The alliance with Tostig was an astute move by Harald. He would not only gain a military ally, but also a weakness in the heart of Harald's kingdom. The embarkation of the fleet was an event of epic proportions. Thousands of men gathered on the coasts of Norway, ready to fight for their king. Harald knew that the expedition was risky, but he was a man of risk. He had a reputation to defend and an empire to conquer. The fleet, with its sails inflated by the wind, set off for the south towards England. The world was watching, and the fate of 3 men and 3 kingdoms was at stake. Harald's final fleet was not just an army. It was a symbol of his ambition, his determination, and his conviction that he was the man that destiny had chosen to rule England. The ocean, which had been his playground for years, would now become the stage of his last journey, a journey that would lead him to glory or death. The arrival of Harald Hardrada's fleet in England was brutal and unexpected. He and his army landed on the northern coasts, near York, and quickly met with opposition. Earl Edwin of Mercia and Earl Morcar of Northumbria led the English forces in the north, and they were determined to stop Harold's advance. The battle that followed, known as the Battle of Fulford, was a crushing victory for the Norwegians. The English army, although brave, was no match for the experience and ferocity of Harold's men. The battle was a massacre, and Edwin's and Morcar's forces were defeated. The victory at Fulford was a strategic triumph. It opened the way to the city of York, which was one of the most important centers in the north of England. Harold took the city, and the nobles of York surrendered, offering hostages and promises of loyalty. For Harold, the victory at Fulford was a sign that his campaign would be a success. He had defeated an English army and had conquered one of the most important cities in the kingdom. He was closer than ever to his final goal, the throne of England. However, his victory at Fulford was a Pyrrhic victory, as it made him underestimate the determination of his rival, Harold Godwinson, who was already on the move, coming from the south to face him. The Battle of Fulford was the prelude to the climax of his life, the moment when he would be confronted with his destiny. After the victory at Fulford and the surrender of York, Harald Hardrada made what would become his fatal mistake. Confident in his victory and the lack of opposition, he decided to camp his army at Stamford Bridge, a bridge that connected the two banks of the River Derwent, about 8 miles from York. His army was exhausted, and many of his men had left their heavy equipment and armor on the ships, expecting the fighting to be over. He was confident that Harold Godwinson, the King of England, was still in the south, preparing for the invasion of William the Conqueror. Harold's assumption was a fatal miscalculation. While he and his men were relaxing, Harold Godwinson's army marched at an incredible pace of over 180 miles in 4 days. The arrival of the English army was a complete surprise for Harold. He was unprepared, and his army, with its light armor, was at a disadvantage. Chaos and confusion spread among the Norwegians. The battle that followed was a massacre. Harold's men, although valiant, were no match for the discipline and fury of Harold's army. The mistake of Stamford Bridge was a brutal lesson in war. Overconfidence can lead to defeat. Harold, the man who had survived so many battles and intrigues, would be defeated by his own arrogance. The stage was set for the climax of his life, the battle that would decide the fate of 3 kingdoms. Before the start of the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a legendary and dramatic moment occurred. According to the sagas, a single horseman approached the Norwegian battle line, shouting for Harald Hardrada. The horseman was the King of England, Harold Godwinson. He offered to give his exiled brother Tostig the earldom of Northumbria and a third of the kingdom, but he offered nothing to Harold. When Harold asked what would be given to him, Harold Godwinson replied with a phrase that would become legendary: 7 feet of land or more, as he is taller than other men. The answer was a clear indication that the only thing Harold would receive was a grave. The peace offer, although not genuine, was a moment of great emotion. Harold, the man who had spent his life in search of power and wealth, was now being offered a grave in a kingdom he believed was his. Harold's response was as clear as Harold's. He rejected the peace offer, declaring that he would never be defeated by an English army, and that he would fight to the death for his right to rule England. The confrontation between the 2 Harolds, one Norwegian and one English, was a moment of great symbolism. Both were kings, both were warriors, and both were determined to fight for their destiny. The conversation between them was a prelude to the brutality that would follow, a battle that would not be one of honor, but of annihilation. The Battle of Stamford Bridge began with one of the most legendary and brutal stories in Viking history. The Norwegians, surprised and outnumbered, retreated to the bridge that would give the battle its name. The bridge was narrow, and the English army could not cross it. It was then that a single Norwegian warrior, possibly a berserker, stood up to defend the bridge. The legend says he was a man of gigantic proportions, with a battle axe in each hand, and that he alone killed dozens of English soldiers who tried to cross the bridge. He was a wall of flesh and blood, a force of nature that no one could stop. The berserker was the symbol of Viking brutality and ferocity. He fought for his king, for his honor, and for his life. His resistance allowed the Norwegians to reorganize and prepare for battle. However, the legend says that an English soldier, in an act of daring, went down the river and stabbed the berserker from below, through the planks of the bridge, killing him. The berserker's death was the end of hope for the Norwegians. With the bridge unblocked, the English army crossed, and the battle became a massacre. The brutality of the Battle of Stamford Bridge was a reflection of Harald Hardrada's brutality. The war he had waged throughout his life now turned against him. The Battle of Stamford Bridge turned into a carnage. The Norwegians, outnumbered and poorly equipped, fought with the ferocity of men who had nothing to lose. Harald Hardrada, the merciless, was on the front line, leading his men with his axe and sword. He fought like a lion, killing dozens of English soldiers, and inspiring his men to fight to the end. He was the personification of war, the last and greatest Viking legend. At the height of the battle, when victory seemed impossible, he was hit. An arrow, fired by an English archer, found its mark, piercing his neck. The death of Harald Hardrada was a moment of great symbolism. The man who had survived so many battles and intrigues, the man who had ruled an empire and dreamed of more, now lay dead on the battlefield, in a kingdom he never ruled. His death marked the end of an era, the end of the Viking Age. He was the last great Viking warrior, and his death was the epitaph for the way of life he had defended. The Norwegians, seeing the death of their king, lost hope and fled. The battle, which seemed like a certain victory for Harald, became his final defeat. His death, his life, which was a tapestry of victories and ambitions, ended on a battlefield, in a kingdom he had underestimated. The death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Norwegian resistance. Their defeat was total and overwhelming. Of the thousands of men who embarked on his fleet, only a few hundred survived. Harald's son Olaf, who was with the fleet, was spared by Harold Godwinson, the King of England. In an act of unexpected clemency, Olaf and the survivors were allowed to return home, promising that they would never invade England again. The scene of the Norwegian fleet's departure, with only a few ships filled with defeated and demoralized men, was a dark reminder of the greatness and fall of Harald Hardrada. The defeat at Stamford Bridge was a crucial moment in history. It not only marked the end of an era, but also weakened the English kingdom. Harold Godwinson, the King of England, who had just defeated Harold, now had an exhausted and weakened army. He had no idea that a new, even greater threat was on its way. The defeat at Stamford Bridge was not just Harold's defeat, but the first step to Harold's defeat. The death of Harald Hardrada and the defeat at Stamford Bridge had immediate and profound consequences for the Kingdom of England. Harold Godwinson's victory was celebrated, but the price of victory was high. His army was exhausted and weakened. The elite of his warriors, the Huscarls, had been decimated, and the remaining forces were disorganized and exhausted. King Harold, the great winner of Stamford Bridge, now had a vulnerable kingdom and an army that needed time to recover. He did not know, however, that time was a luxury he did not have. Harold's death also had a direct impact on Norwegian politics. His death created a power vacuum, and the kingdom, which he had unified with an iron fist, was now in a state of uncertainty. His death was a fatal blow to the ambition of expanding the Norwegian Empire. Norway, which had been the most powerful force in Scandinavia under Harold's reign, was now weakened and vulnerable. Harold's death was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. Just a few days after Harold Godwinson's victory at Stamford Bridge, the fate of England was sealed. William, Duke of Normandy, who had waited patiently for his chance, landed on the southern coast of England. He had prepared his fleet and his army for months, and was ready for battle. Harald Godwinson, who had marched incredibly to face Harald Hardrada, had to march back to the south to face a new and more powerful threat. The two armies met at Hastings, and the battle that followed was one of the most important in European history. Harald Godwinson's army, exhausted and weakened, was no match for the discipline and strength of William's Normans. Harold was killed in combat, and his death marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and the beginning of Norman rule. The Battle of Hastings was the direct result of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. If Harald Hardrada had not invaded England, Harald Godwinson would not have had to march north, and he would not have been weakened. The death of Harold and the victory of Harald Godwinson at Stamford Bridge, ironically, led to his own defeat. The death of Harald Hardrada is often cited by historians as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. The way of life of raiding and conquest, which had lasted for almost 3 centuries, had come to an end. Harold was the last great Viking warrior, the last to dream of conquering empires. His death at Stamford Bridge was the epitaph for the way of life he had defended. The Vikings would not cease to exist, but they would cease to be a force of expansion and invasion. They would become organized kingdoms, with laws and centralized governments, and the spirit of conquest would be replaced by the spirit of commerce. Norway, under Harald's reign, had become a military power, but his death created a power vacuum that led to a period of instability. His death was a fatal blow to the ambition of Norwegian expansion, and the nation, which had been a force of expansion, now turned back to itself, to defend itself from its enemies. Harald's death is seen as the end of an era of great heroes and the rise of an era of kings and nations. He was the last man who believed that force and the sword were the only way to conquer the world, and his death was proof that the world was changing. The death of Harald Hardrada and the rise of William the Conqueror forever changed the political map of Europe. The power vacuum in Norway led to a period of instability, with Harald's sons, Olaf and Magnus, vying for the throne. The kingdom, which Harald had unified with an iron fist, fragmented once again, and the spirit of conquest was replaced by the spirit of civil war. Norway, which had been a power, now became a vulnerable and weakened kingdom. The rise of William the Conqueror in England was even more significant. The Norman conquest of England changed the culture, politics, and language of the kingdom forever. Anglo-Saxon rule was replaced by Norman rule, and England became a kingdom more aligned with continental Europe. The Battle of Hastings was the beginning of a new era, and the direct result of Harald Hardrada's ambition. He was the catalyst for one of the most important events in European history, and his death was the turning point that sealed the fate of three kingdoms. He was the last Viking, but his legacy was that of a man who, in his death, changed the world forever.